da, 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 da. Really, really big shout out to John Keller for that beat. I told him that I needed an amazing beat for the African Music Law show, and he delivered. And every time I hear that beat, I get to dancing. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, 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 AML fam. Welcome to another episode of the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. If you are keeping up, then you know we are at the 156th episode. And I'm so delighted to talk to you and introduce you to our guest for today. But before we do that, for those who are joining us for the first time, let me tell you who we are. We are about the business of empowering the African artist wherever that artist can be found, whether on the continent, in the diaspora, or just everywhere possible. Asia, Europe, North America, Africa. That's what we do. But we don't stop there. We also empower the creative industry at large because we're all interconnected. And for us, it's so, so vital and important that Africa is not kept, in the back burner or at the back seat, but that we always have a table and are always part of the global conversation on our entertainment industry and the music industry at large. So when we started this platform in 2011, it was about not asking permission, but saying, look, you either come roll with, give us that opportunity to be at the table with you. Otherwise, we're going to build ours, and then you come join us. And I can truly say that we've seen overall the West as a whole and industry stakeholders come to join us in that process and are now very interested in what we're doing on the continent, in the diaspora, with Afrobeats, Afrofusion, and all things Africa. So this is the authority when it comes to music law and entertainment law and music business and entertainment business relating to the African continent, the deal making, the lawsuits, the drama, everything else. That's what we do. We also invite some of our amazing experts to come on and talk about what they do, which is what our guest is going to be doing today. If you would like to subscribe, certainly find us on our website, www.africanmusiclaw.com. That's a great place to go to just subscribe generally to the newsletter and, of course, the podcast as well. In the alternative, if you're just looking only for the podcast, you can certainly subscribe on our major streaming platforms. That includes Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, for purposes of comments, please feel free to ask your questions, leave your comments, and I'll pull that into the stream so that you get an opportunity to have that answered in real time with our guest. So who is our guest? Our guest today is Keith Kirk. I'm so excited to have him. He's a metadata analyst, a music metadata analyst / specialist, if you will. He's worked in the industry for over 20 years and primarily worked with a lot of the major music brands. So you're talking major global music brands. So Universal, Sony, so many others, BMG, et cetera, et cetera. And he's going to tell you, especially if you're an artist or you work with an artist, liaison in anywhere with an artist, why you need to stop leaving all this money, royalties on the table. It's unacceptable. We're in the business of music. Be about that business, which includes getting and securing your money back. And the way you do that is partly to look at specifically what you're doing on that metadata side. So I'm happy and excited to invite my guest and introduce him to you. Keith Kirk, welcome, welcome, welcome. What's up? How are you?
Hi, Ms. Uduak. So great to be here. This is so fantastic. I love this Africa music law. Africa is a massive market in music business. So really, really excited that this sort of thing is happening and you've built this space for creatives. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for honoring my request and joining me with my audience. So the first thing I want to get into, I see a comment already coming in. So let's see what that comment is. That is from Nelson Mukoro. He says, I remained you all through the time. I don't know if you mean remind. I'm not sure what that means, but I think you're saying remind. But thank you so much. Please join us for the rest of this conversation that we're about to get into. So let's start off with your background. Keith, who are you? Tell the people.
So Keith, I'm from London originally, North London. I grew up in music. Actually, when I was born, I was sent to the West Indies. I grew up on a campus there called the Caribbean Union College. And that college was full of music, choirs. I'd like to name Dr. Andrews, these people who really opened my eyes and my appetite to music, right? So there was just a lot of music. My family was in music, my aunts, my parents, everybody sang in the choirs and the groups and in sextets and quartets and trios, and it was just
Wow.
full of just music all the time. And I just naturally had that inclination. And later on, years later, I found out that my grandfather had perfect pitch, which I didn't even know he had. So my entire family is into music. All my cousins either sing or play an instrument.
Wow. Oh my God.
It's ingrained in my family. So that's a bit of background.
So it being ingrained in your family, has that passed on for purposes of you actually playing any instruments, and do you sing?
Oh yeah, I did quite a lot of singing back in the day. I sang with this choir in England called the London Adventist Chorale, and we sang. We did a lot of amazing events. So in 2002, that's probably one of our biggest events. We did the prom at the Palace. I don't know if you remember that, but the Queen had 2 concerts in her garden at the Palace. One was like a classical concert, and one was like a rock concert. So the biggest artist in the world descended on her garden, and she's like, my gardeners are going to have a field day when they see this. But, we were there and we performed in front of millions of people around the world. I think it was like 7 or 8 million people, 70 million, it was some big number.
Wow.
So I did a lot of singing like that. And
so on that scale,
on that scale, smaller and on that scale. And then in 2017, I got the auspicious opportunity to record the entire Black Panther soundtrack, right? So all the music that you hear in that movie, and even some of the Foley, me and about 27 other singers at Abbey Road Studios recorded the entire Black Panther soundtrack, which
really?
Yes, it was embargoed, right? So you got the contract, and all the contract had was Marvel on it, right? So I was like, Marvel, okay, this seems to be something special. Went in there, recorded over a few hours, came back about a week or 2 later to do some more recording, and then in the new year, come to find out, it was Black Panther. So that's been kind of my experience with music and performance, and I've written and arranged music and stuff like that. So
such a rich history. And what is interesting to me also, beyond how rich that is you mentioned something about the Adventist chorale. So it seems like Adventists are just coming out of the woodworks. I'm Adventist. I definitely share it publicly. So are you Adventist?
I am a Seventh-day Adventist.
Excellent. Okay. There are a lot of us in the industry. So it's good to see everyone coming out of the woodwork. Shout out to everyone else. Stevie Mackey, I don't know if you're familiar with them in the industry. Adventist, Stevie Mackey.
Oh, I know Stevie very well.
Okay, yeah, that's somebody I look forward to having on the show.
Oh, wow.
Well. Yes, I mean, just all this Adventists with this such huge talent.
And so the choir that he was connected to, it's funny that you say Stephen McKee, because that guy's a beast.
Yes.
Right? And I know he works with Jennifer Lopez and he works with stuff like that. But I think he went to the university of this choir called the Aeolians. I don't know if you know them.
I know he went to Oakwood, but didn't know that part.
Oakwood Aeolians. They became the world choir champions about 3 years ago. World choir. And the conductor, who's a close friend of mine, and is also Trinidadian, he got world conductor of the year. So
wow,
conductor,
that's amazing.
Yes, so this is another.
That's amazing. Well, I definitely will be tapping into it, because it is really about educating people, and part of that education is musical education. I had a lot of music courses growing up. And even in college at some point was a music minor before I switched to philosophy. So there's the ability to hear music by ear, but also the ability to also just understand the fundamental aspect of music theory. And I think that's really important as well. So good to hear about all this amazing talent out there. So let's continue on with your journey. How do you go from just singing and performing to metadata? Like, there's nothing sexy about metadata for the most part. So how did you get there?
Well, I spent some time in the Caribbean, and I worked at the local music business in Trinidad and Tobago there for a while. And then obviously, there was coming time, okay, well, let me go back to London, see what I can do. I went to university, I did an undergrad in music there. Then I think I came back a bit, and then I went back to London, and I did a master's in music business. And after that, I got a job at PPL, the Phonographic Performance Limited, which is the digital PRO, which is equivalent to Sound Exchange in America.
Mm-hmm.
Worked at PPL for about 4 weeks, and I get this message on LinkedIn from Universal saying, "Hey, we'd like to see you." I was like, "What? Universal? You want to see me? Okay." So I head down there. It was literally not an interview. It was like an informal chat in the office. They were very gracious, very welcoming. They basically just wanted to tell me what the job was about and if I wanted. Right? It really wasn't an interview, and I didn't really know what it was exactly. Come to find out, I was one of 2 metadata analysts at Universal. And that's kind of where my journey started.
Okay, so stop right there, just quickly before you continue. How did they even know about you, that you did metadata work, in order to even invite you and say, would you like the opportunity?
I don't think they knew. I think they saw my background, my CV, on my LinkedIn.
Got it.
Like, oh, maybe this guy may be able to do this kind of work, They had no idea I could do this. And I had no idea either. I had no idea about it in that way.
Okay.
So I think they looked at my CV, because I always try to keep my LinkedIn profile up to date and whatnot. So they looked at it and they gave me a call. So
that really speaks to that power, everyone. If you're watching this or listening, to the power of ensuring you're really branding yourself out there. That we talked about it, I think episode 152, when we had Steve Wasage on the show, social media marketing for artists, that brand consistency across platforms, and because you never know who's looking. So absolutely.
Yeah. So that was, and even today, I just keep it up to date, and I make sure that people can look at it and get onto it and find the pertinent information that they need. So they called me in, and I started the job, and come to find out, I was literally one of 2 metadata specialists at Universal I was kind of like a quality check-in analyst. So we're trained to quality check metadata, because when you're delivering metadata to the DSPs, the digital service providers like TuneCore, Tidal, Spotify, etc., they have very, very, very strict rules and regulations and standards about how metadata appears on their platform, right? There's a lot of rules and a lot of regulations, and if you deliver it wrong, it gets rejected. So
I don't want us to go just too far just yet. Let's put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. I still want to unpack, get into the role. It sounds like it was carved out for you. So even you had all this extensive music experience, but you weren't necessarily doing metadata work just yet. So this was the opportunity that was exclusively created based on your background.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow, that's amazing. So now let's start inching our way towards why we have artists and those who represent them leaving so much money on the table. First things first, what did the job entail, and what were some of the challenges you found about this whole metadata space you were getting into?
So the job was basically this. Because Universal and a lot of the big labels like Sony, etc., when they're delivering their metadata to the DSPs, they have something called direct access, meaning they don't have to go through a third party to get their data delivered to iTunes. They deliver directly to iTunes. However, to sort of manage the bad metadata that's delivering and get the most accurate data, clean data possible, Universal decided to set up a department that would quality check this metadata before it goes off. Now, we weren't just quality checking national or local metadata, we were quality checking metadata around the globe. So every country around the globe that has a Universal office will send us all of their releases with the associated metadata, we would check it through and say, okay, no, you can't have that, remove that, oh, spell that like this, put that there, take that out, can't do that, can't do this. You send it back to them. That's very important because we can't make the change. Because if we make a change and it's wrong, we're liable. So you got to send it back, let them make the change, then they send it back. We check it over once more. If there's still issues, we tell them correct this. They correct it, send it back, correct it, and then when everything checks out, then we push it through the DSPs.
Okay, so very interesting. So you talk about we can't make the change and some of the challenges that may be in there. Let's back up a bit and break it down some more with the specific issues you found that you saw, talents particularly making when they're submitting. Or maybe let me back up. Why don't you sort of share that value chain of how that artist music gets to you in order for you to be able to, within the context of the majors and then independently, in order for you to then assess the quality of the data submitted and then send it to the DSP.
Okay, so what I was referring to, this was major label stuff. This is not independents submitting stuff. So it's on universal offices around the globe managing our internal artists, and you have persons in that department setting up the metadata for our major label artists, right? No independents we're talking about.
Yeah.
So this work that we're doing it on behalf of the artists that are signed to the label, right? So every office around the globe would send us what they've set up. And if they've not set it up correctly, then we will make those changes. So some of the challenges would be, well, the first thing was the language barrier. Because you're talking about Germany, Japan, China, Indonesia, all these places that there's a language barrier. So often you have to have meetings to really try and get them to understand what they can input and what they can't and why. Other things would be like if the artist would submit an album cover that it's someone naked, breast showing or something showing that, and that's a no-no, right? Or you can't have things like deluxe version on the album cover, or you can't have something called compound artists. That was always a big one. So like Lennon and McCartney, they are an official compound artist. A compound artist is two artists as an entity, right? Lennon and McCartney, Simon and Garfunkel, etc. They are an official recognized entity. So if you and I, Miss Uduak, did an album and then you put Miss Uduak and Keith Kirk, that's a rejection, right? So little things like that, we would check and recheck and send it back for them to make those changes before it can be delivered, because iTunes will reject it.
Got it. And so at some point you get a chance to work with independent labels or brands, right? It's not you've not just exclusively stayed with major labels, have you?
Yes. Well, I only started working with independents when I stopped working at the majors, right? So the stuff I learned at the majors became so invaluable for me to help independent labels and publishers and artists, right? But I realized quickly that I still had to do a lot of my own research to really get into this really deeply, because I was filling a niche that wasn't there. So when I work with independent labels and artists, I help them set up their metadata from scratch. From the first note you write on a piece of paper to understanding the splits, the codes, the publishing, the copyright information, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that really hands-on work that's involved in it. So I want to transition into that part, but is there anything else on the highlight for working with the majors that you want to share, particularly on the side of even how majors you found were losing money prior to your service being involved in that because that metadata wasn't being done the way it's supposed to, like bad metadata was causing the DSPs to reject them, more time spent having to source and figure all that out, which obviously affects the bottom line as well. So just talk a little bit about that. Then we're just going to go indie all the way for a lot of our demographic that tends to skew that way.
Right. Well, just to be clear, the major labels weren't having so much issue when it came to losing money. Because the major labels understand the process and the importance of metadata, right?
Have that infrastructure in place.
They have the infrastructure in place, right? But because organizations like Universal and Sony who are delivering, who have that direct access, that's a special thing to have direct access to iTunes and Spotify. Everybody else has to go through a third party, but they have that direct access. But to maintain that, they are graded by iTunes and Spotify. So a lot of people know Universal and iTunes and Sony, whatever, when they're delivering, they have to maintain a 95 percentile and above success delivery rate to maintain that direct access. Right? That's why guys like me were so important, because just before we're about to send it, we would double check again to make sure it's correct, make sure there's nothing's missed, a name is spelled wrong, or something's there, or a curse word, or something is not there. We'd find it, check it, and then remove it, fix it, and then deliver it.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the breakdown on, you have the majors able to go directly to the digital retailers is what you're saying. But for everyone else, if you're part of this ecosystem and you're on the indie side, then you have that digital distributor, if you will, serving as the middleman or woman in order to then have it go to the digital retailers. And that's what Keith is referring to. So Keith, what's intriguing to me are the issues of technology, right? And how you're able to use technology systems to be efficient. Because even individual consulting where you're working with the indie artists, it would seem to me that if those technologies are not in place, then it ends up being very gruesome, intense work that nobody's per se interested in doing unless you're a nerd in that way. So what technological systems are you using? You don't have to tell us all, but just like the framework of the technology tools that are necessary for you to even do this efficiently.
Believe it or not, I use spreadsheets.
Ah, really?
Simple spreadsheets.
Wow.
That's what I use. That's what we use at Universal, Sony, all the major labels, we use spreadsheets.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in conjunction with like a bespoke database, right? So you would have a really nice database that you can enter your username and password. It has all the data on it, blah, blah, blah. But we still use spreadsheets, right? And
like your Excel, Microsoft Excel or Google Excel.
Yeah. Listen, we use probably 2% of the capabilities of a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are extremely powerful, and you can do some amazing things with those things, right? So when I'm working with artists, I use a spreadsheet to manage their data. Now, I do have another platform that I use as well called tuneregistry.com. And I would sort of import a lot of that data onto tuneregistry.com to sort of have like a second,
cloud-based,
like a base.
Yeah.
But generally, it's all spreadsheets. It's literally spreadsheets.
And you are right.
Sorry?
You are right that even when I think of the use of Microsoft Word, most people don't even use it to the full 100% capacity. And definitely with Microsoft Excel or Google Excel, I mean, I don't think people even come to 10% close to the knowledge and an ideology they need to have about how to use it. And there are lots of tutorials, especially artists, who might look and say, well, Keith can only do so much. We still got to get this thing right. You know, there are lots of YouTube tutorials that teach you how to use Excel and spreadsheets as a whole too. Wow, fascinating. So you then transition and now you're working with indie artists, right? So tell us a little bit about how that process was and then the challenges you're seeing when it comes to the indie side? Because I know they're leaving a lot of money on the table, because I have to interface with them on the law side of things as a lawyer and representation side. But I'm just curious, the transition and then what you found.
The transition was easy, right? Because when I finished at these majors, I was like, well, before I was at the majors, I sit down and I was like, there's about 1,000 people in this building, and these people are working very hard to get one record to the market. One, about 1,000 people doing different things to take one album to the market. And I was like, how on earth does the indie artist compete with this? They don't have all these bodies and all this big machine behind them to do all this stuff that needs to be done. While they can just go in the studio and write and tour and do all these things. And I was like, you know what? Because I was still dabbling in music and touring and doing stuff like that. I was like, there is a market here. And so, I would start talking to people, artists and stuff like that, who have been out there, they're touring, they're making money. And you said, so which PRO are you with? They're like, what? And I was like, you don't know what a PRO is? And you're out there touring and making money? If these artists are out here doing stuff in a major way, and they don't even know what a PRO is, I see a market there, I see a gap. So I started really studying and getting myself more into what is metadata, how is it, keeping a close, like Redex is like on my pillow. Right? Like they are the organization that's standardizing metadata across the music universe. So I started studying and really understanding metadata from what I've already learned and applying it to what I can do. And I started talking to artists about metadata, and I was like, wow, I don't even know what this is. I've never heard about this. And then last year, boom, here comes Clubhouse. And that literally opened floodgates. So that's how the transition was. But the main issue I found is that most people don't know anything about metadata and why it's important and the importance of it.
You know what? I'm fascinated by your story. There's a consistency in the theme of how your use of social media just catapults you to a next level with your career. I'm fascinated, from the LinkedIn with the major music global brands, and now Clubhouse helping you again. So let's just tap into that just a little bit and then come right out to talk about, some of the challenges you were seeing continuously with artists. So you said the floodgates opened once you started to tap into uses like Clubhouse as a social media platform or social audio platform. Can you share with us what that looked like?
Well, look, we're having this conversation right now. This conversation is happening with Miss Uduak because of Clubhouse, right?
True.
So last year, around October, November, I was talking to a young lady from New York. We're talking about music, blah, 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 having a really good conversation. Then she was like, hey, I was listening to these people in a room talk about music or whatever. I was like, oh, okay, cool. She's like, I'll invite you. I was like, okay, cool, sure, no problem. She invites me, I go onto Clubhouse, and that was it. I was like, what? What is this? Because the first time you go onto Clubhouse, it's like you're hearing people talk, right? It's this thing. And so I was on there for a few weeks, and I got the nerve to start talking. But what was happening, I was going into all these music rooms, and they're talking about, is R&B still relevant? And touring, and who should collaborate with who? And I was like, nobody's talking about metadata. Nobody's talking about this. Okay. So I struck up the nerve and I was like, so hi, my name is Keith. I'm from London. I'm a metadata specialist, blah, blah, blah. And I deal with metadata, and metadata is the importance of blah, blah, blah. By the end of my pitch or spiel or whatever, people start telling me, dude, you need to come up. Can you come on my club, in my room? Come on. And I would go into that room and talk about it. And somebody would hear, oh, can you come into my room and come on? And it just blew up from there until everybody basically dubbed me the metadata guru on Clubhouse.
Got it.
Literally, nobody else was talking about this thing.
And you know what's so interesting? I actually knew about you for quite a while. and even had received on the media end, press end, for some of the conferences, music conferences you've appeared on, I've received even press statements regarding your appearances and that of other panelists. But I never tapped into it. I don't know why. It just never resonated enough for me to say, oh, I'd like to have you on my show. And then I was in one of the clubhouse rooms on music, Deborah's room, and heard you speak. And I thought, you know what? Let me invite him on to really unpack this thing, because you spoke with such passion and such meticulous detail about what you do. Even on my social media Instagram page, we share a lot of people in common. And I've seen clips here and there and even seen interviews they've done of you, but I just don't know why it wasn't connecting until Clubhouse. So I do agree that Clubhouse does definitely cement the deal for sure. Where it's sort of sitting there, you're like, okay, why haven't you done anything with this? And it's like, oh, okay, I needed to hear him speak and see what he really offers in that sort of personal, intimate way that Clubhouse affords you. Okay, so jumping right back out of Clubhouse and going back to the artists and some of the challenges that you're seeing on the indie end and how you've been able to help. I just really want to focus on the part of the money, because I think people sort of like tendency to just blank out when you start saying metadata. First, it sounds complicated and artists are like, I can't be bothered. So I'll use an analogy and then maybe you can explain a bit more how that looks like for artists. So for this particular podcast that I have, I'm doing the live stream and then we're going to turn it into a podcast. In order for me to make it available on all the major streaming platforms, I've got to ensure that the details on the back end of that MP3 that's uploaded through my host tags, the title, the artist, which tends to be me, and then the platform that's having it, the African Music Law Show, the company, among other things, right? And then the category so that it can be actually found, and the year, and then the latest episode. Yeah, all those details. And that's basically what you're talking about with relation to the artist. And then you're emphasizing that if you don't do that, there are huge ramifications, primarily, which is the loss of revenue, uncollected royalties. So expand into that discussion a little bit more and what the basics that are necessary, and then how unpaid royalties work, among other things.
So this is Africa music law, right?
Yes.
It belongs to Miss Uduak. It's such and such amount. It's such and such a long length of time. You have Keith Kirk as a special guest. It's this category, etc., etc. That information tells the internet and the digital world who you are and who this entity belongs to, right? And when this goes out into the digital world, it generates revenue. When you go on YouTube, when you go on Google, when you go on any kind of platform, this may end up on a XM radio, iHeartRadio. And anytime it's exploited in that way, there is some revenue attached to it. But if you don't have the information that says this piece of IP belongs to Ms. Uduak, the revenue cannot find you.
Got it.
It cannot find you. So metadata is the mechanism that the music business uses, and a lot of industry uses to track, trace, and find revenue, and then remit that revenue to the copyright or to the IP owner or holder. So if you put information out there and it's just Africa music law, okay, that could be anything. Who does Africa music law belong to? Who is it? Miss Uduak, okay, it belongs to Miss Uduak. What category of entity is this? It's podcast, it's law, it's music. Today, we're specifically talking about metadata. So if someone types metadata in Google, they may type metadata podcast or a podcast about metadata. Those keywords will bring up this piece of IP because those words are in your metadata. And so a lot of times when I was at Universal and Sony, there's a lot of information that we can't find. We can't find contributors, we can't find information, and we'd have to go online to find this information. But you can only find it if the metadata is embedded, right? Secondly, people think that, there's a bunch of people sitting down in an office that then says, oh, Ms. Uduak made $10,000, we need to give her the $10,000. No, it's all managed by databases. It's a bunch of databases sitting there with codes and information that says, oh, the database says, oh, Ms. Uduak, $10,000, this $10,000 belongs to Ms. Uduak, and it automatically pays it out. But if the algorithms and the information in the database isn't there, it can't find Ms. Uduak or African music law or knows who to pay. So it just sits there. It goes nowhere. And that's what happens when independent artists put their stuff out there and they don't have all the relevant metadata, or they don't put the metadata out correctly. For instance, P. Diddy, he's Sean Puffy Combs, Diddy, P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, and now he's Love. That's an administrative nightmare. It's like, is this the same person or is this different people? So the metadata has to say or inform that all those different pseudonyms are connected to one person. Mm-hmm. And that's done through the ISNI code, International Standard Name Identifier. And of course, you can also register all those names with your PRO, your Performing Rights Organization, like ASCAP, PMIs, and stuff like that.
Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about the ISRC code, which you always raise in almost every conversation I've heard you on the ISWC code as well. Can you just address that and what those are?
Very good. So the music business is a vast place, right? There are 7 million artists, 100 million songs uploaded every year, billions of streams and trillions of data, right? It's a lot of information. So even if humans could do it, there'd be a lot of error. So what the music business did is they came up with a bunch of codes to manage these all this information. So when you sign up with a PRO like ASCAP or BMI or PRS in England, the first thing they give you is an IPI code, Interested Parties Information. That IPI code recognizes you as a songwriter globally. So if I take my IPI code from PRS and plug it into the ASCAP database, it will pull up all my information about Keith Kirk, right? When you then register your song with ASCAP or BMI, they will issue something called an ISWC code, an International Standard Word Code. That code helps to recognize the information in the composition, right? You can only have one ISWC code, but that ISWC also will only be issued if all the contributors are accounted for. So let's say the Uduak and I write a song, and they have all the Uduak's information, but they're missing 1 or 2 pieces of information about me. They will not issue the ISWC code. Until that information is submitted, then they will issue that ISWC code. And if you don't have an ISWC code, I like to say, technically, your song is not eligible for licensing. Meaning, if a music supervisor wanted to license your song for any reason, they can look at your song and say, there's no ISWC code, so you're going to pass on that, because music supervisors are very, very careful to ensure that all the contributors are accounted for, or the copyright is right, or the information is there before they license this, right? Because they don't want to license something and then 2 months later somebody comes and says, "Oh, I didn't give permission to do that."
Yeah.
Now they do license songs without ISWCs, but that's a whole other situation. So that's the ISWC. It's a code that recognizes the information in the composition, right, or the publishing. Now the ISRC, which has been the most contentious code, I don't know why, but as the International Standard Reporting Code, it's a code that helps to recognize the information about the sound recording. So you have the composition, you have the sound recording, two different things, but that make up the entire song. There's one song split into two: composition, sound recording. Composition has an ISWC, the sound recording has an ISRC. The difference about the ISRC, the International Standard Recording Code, is that you can have multiple ISRCs for one song. Take, for instance, Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace has one composition, one, but it has thousands of recordings, literally, thousands of recordings. And each of those recordings, once they're commercially released, has its own unique ISRC code. Why? Because that helps to track how each version of the song is doing, right? So each ISRC will tell you, oh, this version of Amazing Grace did way better than this version of Amazing Grace. And we can see that through the ISRC code. So think of the ISWC and the ISRC as the ISWC being the parent and the ISRC is the children.
Oh, very interesting. Another way I try to compare it to make it easy for some of the artists that I talk to about it is like going to a grocery store, buying that old school CD, and you have that code at the back of it that the cashier is going to have to ring through. And then for each one of those CDs sold, it gives you an overall overview of the sales at the end of the, whatever the quarter or whatever the counting is, that tells you how much of that particular album was sold. So it's sort of the same ideology in terms of having that code, but the difference is we now have it on the digital space, but it still serves the same kind of purpose. But really like also how you've broken it down as well. So having said all that, let's begin to just pull it completely in and bring it home on the tail end with just the business as a whole. So where I want to go with it is directed to the continent and also the Caribbean, where you are. I've been at this since 2011, so a little over 10 years now with respect to African music law, and actually go back to 2007, total of about 14 years, where I was receiving and continue to receive a lot of music from our creatives. And when I received those single files, MP3s, etc., on the press side, hey, publish my music, please, Miss Uduak or your team, so that I can have the publicity to be seen consistently. Back then, things are changing a little bit. You never saw all this stuff, this metadata you're talking about. So for some of our legacy artists on the continent, same in the Caribbean as well, and even new school of artists coming up, a lot of that information is missing. So another thing that's happening is I'm now seeing on the legal side of things where you're having third parties that nobody knows that are claiming those royalties with whether it's PROs or publishers, et cetera, claiming they are publishers, registering with performance rights organizations, among others, or working with third-party sync licensing companies and collecting. And for the most part, because of that back-end tracks that have been sent in the past where nobody has any metadata, artists can't really collect, but they're frustrated because here's this third party, they don't even know who's claiming that they gave them consent and they are their representatives and they're collecting on their behalf. So can you sort of speak to what do you begin to do? What advice you would have to the industry at large on how to go back to those back catalogs that are already out there with music, but no metadata whatsoever?
Yeah, it's a hot mess. What I'll start to say is that the music business thrives on the ignorance of artists. If you don't know, they thrive, right? So the more you know, the better. In terms of going back to your back catalog and fixing, if someone is taking your money, hopefully you didn't sign anything, and someone is taking money that doesn't belong to them, you can go back with a lawyer, with an attorney, and have that fixed. Because the bad metadata and the reason why a lot of people don't see any money is because a lot of that money is going into the black box. because it can't find you because of the bad metadata. But then you have unscrupulous managers and people saying, yeah, I'll do it all for you, I'll do all the paperwork, right? I'll fix it, whatever. And what's happening is the artist is touring constantly, but they're not seeing any revenue, any royalties coming in because they're touring and they're making that money. But when the tour's dried up now, they're not seeing any revenues. And actually, because of the pandemic, a lot of things are happening. It's like, wait a minute, but how come I'm not seeing any royalties coming through? I'm not touring now. And a lot of artist managers are being called out. And like, what happened? What did you do with the paperwork? And what we're seeing is that a lot of these managers have signed up copyright to themselves. Let that money come to themselves, and some of these artists have never seen a penny. A lot of times because they've been touring, they tour all the time. So what has to happen is that you've got to get a lawyer, an attorney, entertainment attorney specifically, to help you go back and understand how these registered, what happened with the registration, whose name it's been registered in, what publisher, what sync entity, etc., and ensure that it's registered to you. You have the right share of the revenue. You may not have all, you may not have 100%, but it must be enough for you to see royalties coming into your account.
Awesome. So I think we've pretty much covered all the key things that I wanted to get at today. So let's start getting ready to wrap it up. Where can our audience find you, and what are the current projects that you're working on if they're interested in working with you?
You can find me on IG at Keith Anthony, KeithAnthony. You can connect with me in there, or you can connect with me at contact@Motif Music Services. That's MOTIF for Freddie, musicservices.com. And reach out to me at e-consultations, where I go really in depth and help you set up your metadata strategy from scratch. So you can reach out to me on IG and provide that email.
Okay, and actually, you know what? Just give me what is your website so I can just put it right across.
Yes, Motif, MOTIF,
S.
Services.com.
Motivservices.com?
Yeah, motifmusicservices.com.
Okay, motives with an S.
No, this was an F.
Okay, motive, TIF, musicservices.com. Okay, so let's put it here. So you see it right there, everyone, motivmusicservices.com. Go check him out. And from there, you're also able to access the Instagram page, right? The links to the Instagram page, among other things, where you can find Keith Kirk. Keith, I want to thank you so much for being here. I really learned a lot overall in terms of sort of the back end of how you worked with the majors. That's always interesting to get an insight into that. And also just learning about your background. I'm just floored with how much music background you have. So thank you for joining us. Please wait in the green room. Let me say goodbye to my audience, and I'll join you for a quick chat. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another episode of the African Music Law. I can't even talk. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another episode of the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. It will be available via podcast for listeners. And for those viewing again, look forward to you joining me again next week when we take on yet another topic and a guest about, all things relating to the business as a whole. Thanks again. Have a great, awesome weekend, and see you all very soon. Cheers. Bye.